And here we are, at the end of the road. 16 episodes later, and our first season of Historically Speaking is coming to an end. What do we have to show for it? A lot, to be honest with you, but the main thing is, where we are now in pro wrestling was somewhat inevitable. Historically Speaking, I'm Matt Ryan, and this is the season finale of the first national wrestling promotion that set the template for the next 40 years of pro wrestling and how the WWF just got really lucky. As we saw with what Eddie Einhorn did to make his fortune back in episode 1, television and the concept of syndication and then cable, we're going to bring pro wrestling into the national consciousness no matter what. Why? Well, from the advent of the television to the cord-cutting bundle, pro wrestling, pro sports, and pornography have been at the forefront of, well, the entire concept of a visual medium. It's an odd trio to be certain, but it's the truth. Whether it be pay-per-view, streaming, or social media, all three have codified themselves into the evolving trends of how we take in content. And within that Venn diagram between all three, it was the fact that it's cheaper, more sustainable, and provided more volume than almost any other traditional means of entertainment. As cable and syndication were less novel concepts and more in tune as the industry standard, more and more pro wrestling programming was being pulled to the motherships and satellites that lit up the airwaves. If the IWA was 3 years later, or even started at the dawn of 1980, there might have been a different ballgame for them, especially when it came to who would be handling nearly all aspects of this business side of wrestling. While the IWA may have died an unmerciful death at the hands of the pro wrestling establishment, it did reveal the playbook of how to run a national territory. The issue was that Einhorn didn't have the patience or taste to do what needed to be done, and to be honest, a lot of the people in place to build out the wrestling side of the business weren't fit for a national or modern company. It's kind of the rough part of it. The plan was near perfect, the execution just not so much. But that's why time and place matter so much in life and in pro wrestling. Whether it was the retirement, death, loss of the fastball from the old guard who had spent the better part of 30 years fighting against and fighting for the systems of the industry, the mainstreaming of cable television making it possible for any territory to get a national platform, or the burgeoning amount of talent around the country looking to make as much money and raise as much hell as possible, pro wrestling was changing. That's why I think, despite all the credit he's received over the past 40 years, Vince McMahon is more guilty of having good luck and better timing than anything else. Noted time and again in this series, the WWF style of wrestling when the second Vince McMahon bought the company from his father was not great. The angles and some of the main events would be stellar, it created a fair amount of stars to be sure, but the in-ring style was a massive difference, and a massive step down to many who'd grown outside of what was called the Northeast Triangle, which was the confines of the McMahon territory. Even if you watch the television from the WWF and compare it to anything else in that time period, it was night and day. Watch one episode of Georgia Championship Wrestling or Mid-Atlantic against any of the WWF or Triple WF TV of that era and see for yourself. While everybody, rightfully so, talks about 1984 as the year of the biggest weaponizing in the wrestling war, we need to look back to 1982, where the fruit of dissent and discord started to ripen. 1982 would prove to be the year where pro wrestling began its manifest destiny period, where much like the hellish American experiment, it would see robber baron promoters beginning to pick apart at the bones of those less prepared from sneak attacks. If you look at the pro wrestling power structure like a Jenga puzzle, you'll have to look at the pieces that are beginning to be pulled out to see where it's gonna fall. The first and quite possibly the most costly piece to get taken out of the game was the base of the whole industry, Sam Muchnick. At the start of 1982, the man who was the backbone of the National Wrestling Alliance and the pro wrestling establishment for nearly its entire existence was very much too old for this shit and walked away not only from his beloved promotion in St. Louis, but the NWA as a whole. Following the passing of his wife Helen, Muchnick's fire had gone out and decided that New Year's Day 1982 would be his final show as a full-time promoter. Muchnick was very much the cornerstone of the alliance. He was the one person who can keep peace or fan the flames of war if needed. We could debate and argue the moral center of someone who essentially was the capo de tutti capo of a large-scale criminal organization another time. But much like Don Corleone, Sam Muchnick was a symbol of power, peace, and prosperity. But as soon as he was placed out of the picture, to quote another Italian mob icon,
the machines go bullshit.
Muchnick wasn't the only one looking to get out of the game in 1982, as Vince McMahon Sr. was also looking to hang up his promoter hat. The 67-year-old, who had already set up a life for himself and his wife Juanita in Florida, was looking to get out of the Capitol Wrestling game. And while other outside bidders may have wanted to get in on the action, McMahon's son, Vince McMahon Jr., or Vincent J. McMahon for those playing along at home, stepped up and made his dad an offer. McMahon II, who'd been announcing her for his father for nearly a decade at this point, had tried his hand at a variety of projects, most of which were not all that successful. But he had been able to keep the Cape Cod Coliseum afloat after picking up the mortgage for the building in 1979. McMahon, alongside his then-wife and future head of the Department of Education, Linda McMahon, which is horrifying for a litany of reasons, but you don't need to eat at Mel's Diner or screw in a Phillips light bulb to see things like that, put in a bid for the Capitol Wrestling Corporation, and on June 5th of 1982, McMahon would purchase the CWC through Titan Sports and begin his plan of world domination. But hold up there, Pinky. See, while McMahon had the brains to see the whole board, there are still a few more pieces that had to get pulled out to get us to where we were going. 1982 would also be the year that the popular wrestling show that would dominate the WTBS airwaves through 2 wrestling wars for the city, and that time slot would go from Georgia Championship Wrestling to World Championship Wrestling, as the Jim Barnett-owned firm would take the mantle from his prior efforts in Australia. But despite being WTBS's highest-rated show and one of, if not the highest-rated show on cable television, the Atlanta-based booking office was in trouble as it overextended itself financially by running new markets, bringing in some of the best talents in the business, and allegedly Jim Barnett double, triple, or quintuple dipping. It may not also have helped that in 1982, to start things off, Ole Anderson, who not only owned a piece of the Georgia office, was the booker for Georgia Championship Wrestling, and Jim Crockett Promotions, worrying not only about Atlanta and the entire state of Georgia and Ohio and Pennsylvania. Anderson also had to worry about the entirety of the Carolinas, Virginia, and Toronto, a town that Crockett had locked up due to a partnership with promoter Frank Tunney. With his focus back on one territory and a need for his roster to be leaner than pastrami, Anderson would stumble into one of the greatest gimmicks of all time, the Road Warriors. While it would take a while for the gimmick to go from John Laurinaitis' biker man into the paint and spikes we'd all come to know and love, Anderson in 1982 found himself the future of the business. And while he might have found the future of the business, the future of his business was getting bleaker and bleaker, as Anderson would force the hand of Jim Barnett and the other partners and promoters of the company in the winter of 1982, making him the president of Georgia Championship Wrestling and prying away the control of the finances from Barnett and his lavish spending habits. While Anderson in GCW may have been down mid-south just a few states over, was in the midst of an expansion and a year away from Shotgun starting one of the hottest periods of television that has sustained over the last 5 decades. With an already established star like the Junkyard Dog at the top of his cards, Bill Watts, a native Oklahoman, felt it was time for him to promote in the state that he was raised and still lived in. But there was an issue. See, Leroy McGuirk, the man who helped break Watts in as a promoter and as a wrestler, had a contentious professional divorce between him and the Cowboy just a few years earlier, and was still in control of Oklahoma. But barely. McGuirk had enlisted George Scott, the Bill Brashke of this series, as he appears more in myth and in passing as opposed to being an actual part of the main narrative, as the booker of the territory. And as we would see in the WWF and later in what would be known as WCW, Scott had lost his fastball, and seemingly was dragging McGuirk into the grave. Hear that? That's the dam breaking. Watts would do the thing that Einhorn and soon McMahon would do. Went to McGuirk stations in Tulsa, Oklahoma, and Little Rock, Arkansas, two of his 3 biggest markets in the territory, offering Mid-South tapes to the stations along with a rate to take it over from McGuirk's struggling operation. Then the final block would topple as Watts would take control of Oklahoma City TV, essentially crippling McGuirk's efforts into town and eventually buying out the former junior heavyweight champion / blind racist promoter and sending George Scott away into the abyss. 1982 would also be the year that Watts would assume the professional wrestling equivalent to a joint at a dead show by partnering with Paul Bosch to run shows in Houston, and later that year brought in Jerry Jarrett and Jerry Lawler to discuss what the territory needed to grow better, stronger, and faster. This would see Bill Dundee take over the book and the Rock and Roll Express head to Louisiana, along with the creation of a tag team called the Midnight Express and the platforming of a young manager named Jim Cornette. Watts was not the only one expanding beyond his borders with craven capitalistic expediency, as the WWF would begin to run towns in Ohio and also in Pennsylvania that were dormant before Georgia Championship Wrestling would revive the areas burnt out by both Johnny Powers and the Sheik's respective efforts to take over the Buckeye State and some of the adjoining towns in the Keystone State. The WWF would also seek to do what the IWA didn't have a chance to do in their path of a national pro wrestling enterprise, and stake their claim in the City of Angels. By 1982, the Los Angeles territory, now being managed by Mike LaBelle, was dying and needed any semblance of life support. With no stars, no hopes, and no real TV, LaBelle would meet with McMahon at a airport coffee shop in Chicago to negotiate the rights not only to his territory and his buildings, but a place for LaBelle within Titan Sports as the West Coast frontman for the WWF. Not only would McMahon be paying more for Los Angeles than he was paying for the actual territory he was buying from his dad, he quadruple jumped what Watts was doing to take the time slots from McGuirk, offering $130,000 a year, or $2,500 a week in 1982 money, to what was KHJ-TV, also known as KCAL or KCAL now in 2025, who was then owned by RKO General, the same people that owned WOR, a long-standing partner of WWF television. That is the modern equivalent to $428,888.80, or $82.4786 a week in modern money to air TVs in Los Angeles. That's a lot of money. But the WWF would not only take over California, but also try to plant more of a stamp in upstate New York. As before McMahon would jet out west for the sun, he'd look towards Buffalo. As in March of that year, he would bring not only WWF Wrestling to WOR Channel 9, which was up on the satellite, similarly to that of WTBS, but also locally on WUTV, which reached across the border to Toronto. And that would come 3 months before McMahon's purchase of the territory, and the first show coming to Buffalo on August 9th, 2 months after McMahon took over. It makes me wonder if the expansion of Buffalo was something already on the minds of those at the WWF. But who knows? Both towns were operated by Mid-Atlantic Championship Wrestling, which had the aforementioned deal with Tunney and Maple Leaf Wrestling. So again, the Crockett's and McMahons having a bit of a soft conflict before the big conflict. And then you throw in that 1982 Ann Gunkel and Eddie Graham were beginning to talk about a potential promotion that would extend across the country to California and Georgia. And then you have the rapid rise of Stampede in Canada, Ric Flair becoming one of the biggest stars in wrestling and NWA World Champion in 1981 and carrying it into 82. The continuing issues between New Japan and All Japan. Pro wrestling was a powder keg. And we didn't even get to what was going on in Minneapolis. At this point, all the companies we're talking about paled in comparison to what Vern Gagne and the AWA were doing, not only in terms of geography, controlling the Midwest, along with Winnipeg, Las Vegas, Denver, and other towns dotted across the western United States. They had one of the deepest rosters in wrestling, with nearly record houses built off of that massive roster, and the massive rivalry burgeoning between AWA champion Nick Bockwinkel and Hulk Hogan. By spring of 1982, Hulk Hogan went from being fired from the WWF by Vince McMahon Sr. for taking the role of Thunderlips in Rocky III, to the most over babyface in pro wrestling, as he and Bockwinkel would battle nearly for 18 months over the AWA World title.
It will take place here in Chicago on Saturday, the 27th of the month.
Well, I'll tell you something, Mean Gene, the Windy City is the place. The Windy City is going to see it happen, and it's going to get done in the Windy City. It's been a long, rough, rocky road through the AWA, but everybody that's got in my way, everybody that stood in front of me has gone down the tube, right in the center of the ring. And now it finally had to happen. Nick Bockwinkel, get ready for the battle of your life when you step in the center of the ring with Hulk Hogan for the World Heavyweight title.
Gagne would yo-yo the title over the head of Hogan and his fans beginning in April of 1982, where Hogan would win it, but AWA management would overturn the decision days later and return the title to Bockwinkel. This pattern would become a bit of a meme and a central theme to Hogan's story throughout the next 40 years, as this would begin a strain between Gagne and Hogan that would eventually drive Hogan back to the WWF, with Vince McMahon ready to load up the spaceship with rocket fuel and shoot that into the sky. Meanwhile, at that year's NWA promoters meeting, while under pressure from fellow members regarding what was going on with now known as World Championship Wrestling's expansion into other territories, both on TV and in arenas, Jim Barnett looked to keep the peace by offering promoters the chance for their top talent to appear on World Championship Wrestling, whether in the ring live or on tape, to help promote their fellow NWA promoters in areas where World Championship Wrestling was carried, but he also tried to softly shift the blame on the AWA, claiming that they were attempting to land a similar deal with Chicago superstation WGN. And then you had Dallas. In 1982, the Dallas booking office would take things to the next level as they turned their big-time wrestling into world-class championship wrestling. Beginning in 1981 with what was known as Southwest Sports, they would make a deal with KXTX Channel 39 in Dallas, working with producer Mickey Grant and announcer Bill Mercer to completely revitalize the production of the show around Gary Hart's booking and producing. Soon after, the innovations that would come to world class, whether it be music videos, something that was a bit of the norm in places like Memphis, expanded character pieces that would set themselves outside of the arena and in the real world, interacting with one another and making the stories feel more anthemic, along with replays and other modern innovations that the IWA had come up with just 6 years prior. KXTX's parent company, the Christian Broadcasting Network, seeing the ratings, syndicated world class and turned it into the biggest thing in pro wrestling. By Christmas night 1982, World Class had taken the mantle of the most talked about company in pro wrestling outside of the AWA, as Kerry Von Erich would challenge Ric Flair for the NWA World title at Reunion Arena. That night would kick off one of the most infamous angles in pro wrestling, as the Freebirds turned on the Von Erichs in the waning moments of their steel cage main event, inciting chaos in the territory for years to come. But by the end of 1982, Gary Hart, the creative engine of the company, had come to loggerheads with promoter Fritz Von Erich and would end up leaving in favor of Ken Mantell, who'd take over the booking responsibilities immediately after Christmas night. But what happens if Hart stays? What happens if Barnett doesn't get pushed out by Anderson? Or if Hogan gets the AWA belt and it doesn't turn into a long, protracted argument about the title and New Japan money? Or what if the AWA got WGN? 1982 set the stage for what was going to be a golden age of pro wrestling. But instead of these different promotions working together within an ecosystem, without Sam Muchnick to play nice and keep everyone in line, the rise of baby boomer promoters full of the American dream and competitive spirit of heat-death capitalism. What happened next was inevitable. The same promotions and promoters who 8 years earlier were calling Einhorn a heretic and giving him and the IWA the old King of Thieves finish. As we discussed last time, we're pulling the exact same carpetbagger shenanigans, but with a more caustic and fractured industry hanging on for dear life. And this is why Vince McMahon's the luckiest promoter in the history of wrestling. Unlike every other professional venture he had to this point, and following it, let's not forget the WBF, the XFL 1 and 2, and whatever the new thing is that we don't know about, but is probably, never mind. Everything broke his way. Even the stuff that wasn't working, like the houses that died, like he just persisted. 1982 would see everyone starting to take the steps towards a Rubicon that would take shape over the next 16 months, leading to McMahon passing it on July 14th, 1984. But the biggest domino for McMahon, even before Black Saturday, had yet to fall, as in 1982, Southwest Wrestling, operated by promoter Joe Blanchard, was paying $7,000 a week, which in 2025 money is $24,049.12 to air his show on the USA Network. Now, Blanchard couldn't sustain this, and he owed USA a lot of money. And also, it didn't help that Bobby Jaggers poured cow shit all over somebody's head on Southwest Television. But by the fall of 1983, with his father and Barnett officially walking out of the NWA convention that year, following a threat from Ole Anderson over a war for the towns in Ohio and Pennsylvania, McMahon contacted the USA Network and offered to settle Southwest's debts and take over their TV. See, USA and the WWF had a relationship dating back to 1981.
Welcome, everyone, to the Capitol Center here in Landover, Maryland, and what an exciting night of professional wrestling we have in store for you here tonight. Some of the outstanding matches that will appear tonight are Mr. Fuji against the sensational Rocky Johnson, an unbelievable...
Airing live events from the Capitol Center in Landover, Maryland, near the original home of the USA Cable Network in Baltimore. But in 1983, the WWF would premiere All-American Wrestling, which, much like what Barnett offered to promoters just a few years earlier on World Championship Wrestling, an opportunity for talent to be seen all across the country just by sending in a tape. Promoters from all across the country, including World Class and Mid-South, sent tapes into McMahon as he was looking to build his dream roster for the WWF, including Hulk Hogan. I initially set out to show how there could have been a better way, a different way, or any way for these promotions to come together and do something similar to what Dave Meltzer would suggest in an earlier episode about a national wrestling show. But after writing and researching this episode and taking in all the data that we've gone over these many months, the idea of peace was always going to be secondary to the idea of promotional success. Once it was no longer in a promoter's best interest to stay out of another's territory, it turned into all-out chaos. If you take a step back and look at 1982, you can see how Vince won. He was the one with the most to lose, the most to gain, and the biggest safety net. He paid off his partners with profits from Madison Square Garden shows, had a built-in relationship with a major TV partner or two, and ran in some of the biggest markets and population centers in the country. That afforded him the shot to take the risks that he was taking in bringing in more talent, scaling at an insane rate because the core business was going to drive it until something better came along. For Watts, Crockett, Anderson, and others, they wanted bigger towns and bigger shows, but they were not able to scale at the same rate or pay attention to their home markets, which was what ended up killing them in the long run. And for World Class, everyone kept dying, or leaving, or dying. You can tie any one of these scenarios that we've laid out in this episode and say, well, if that doesn't happen, this could do this, and so on and so forth, but the sad truth is that this is reality, and not a movie. And also that there are no real heroes here. These are wrestling promoters. These are people looking and actively did snuff out any and all competition in every circumstance prior to this. So it's hard to feel empathy for them after going through 15 episodes of them trying to do the exact same thing that ended up happening to them. But it doesn't mean I like how it played out. You wish there was something, some moment, some butterfly effect of something that could have changed. Not because I hate what we got from pro wrestling, but because we all suffered for it. Jobs, opportunities for wrestlers and people in wrestling collapsing decade over decade. The ability to develop other styles, build an audience, learn how to work, all of that would slowly become pasteurized and excised from the sport over time, unless you lived and died on the independent circuit, and even then, it got treacherous. For the better part of 40 years, we've only been fed maybe 1, 2, sometimes but fleetingly 3 different styles or flavors of wrestling on American television. Whether they wanted to get drawn into the fight or not, 1982 laid the groundwork that killed territorial wrestling in North America and gave rise to the boom and bust national system we have today. What of our subject for the past 15 episodes, though? It is safe to say without Eddie Einhorn, none of this would have happened, maybe as soon as it did. But he was first through the door and set the table and template for exactly how to and how not to run a national professional wrestling company. And for better or worse, he's the man responsible for making wrestling what it is today, just because he wanted to try and give wrestlers a better opportunity. Well, that's it. That is the end of Season 1 of Historically Speaking. And I want to thank you all, especially our patrons who kept this season going and kept me wanting to work more on this, as it's been one of the things I'm proudest of as a person who makes content on the internet. I'm taking a bit of a break, but not too long, I promise. We'll have some stuff on the Patreon, as I listed on Instagram and on my Patreon. You'll have some short stories from me that will have audio and video elements just like this show, but you'll only be able to watch them first on Patreon. But next month in October, keep on the lookout, stay subscribed, because we will begin Season 2 of Historically Speaking with the history of New York Talk Radio. I'm excited, I am grateful, and this has been Historically Speaking, a production of Ember Media, produced by the support of humans like you. If you want to support, go to patreon.com/historicallyspeaking. That is patreon.com/historicallyspeaking. And sign up for $5. You get every episode for free, plus extra content. You get it before anybody else. So please, please subscribe. Thank you. I love you. I'm gonna go nap now.